lands, and waters. Indigenous peoples have developed knowledge that helps in that endeavor, and that knowledge is as legitimate and valuable as knowledge shared by anybody else who has a PhD or special designation next to their name. It's real legitimate scientific knowledge. It's valuable, and we are now recognizing that for the first time as part of our federal work here. So the Biden-Harris administration takes our climate crisis very seriously and also recognizes that Indigenous knowledge is a foundation for restoring balance with nature. With the recent release of the federal guidance on Indigenous knowledge and the work of many federal agencies, the government is taking proactive steps to recognize and ensure the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in federal policies and decision-making. At the heart of this work is the need to develop collaborative, reciprocal, and equitable relationships with tribal and Indigenous peoples. Federal agencies must engage Indigenous peoples as true and enduring partners and seek their continuing partnership as we move forward in this important work. And so I want to thank all of you for taking your time to join us today, for your work in this partnership. And I look forward to the discussion later today. And I will now turn it over to my friend and colleague, Lisa Barrios.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary. Nice to see everyone here. My name is Lisa Barrios, and I'm a Senior Advisor in EPA's American Indian Environmental Office. I work closely with Jane Nishida, who couldn't be with us today, but she is EPA's Assistant Administrator for the Office of International and Tribal Affairs. And we work together in co-leading the White House Council on Native American Affairs Climate Adaptation Subcommittee. One of the primary goals of this subcommittee is to develop and deliver training for federal agency employees working on climate adaptation priorities. This year, the White House Council on Native American Affairs will host a series of monthly webinars to provide federal employees with educational resources about consulting and coordinating with Indian tribes, Native Hawaiians, and other Indigenous peoples in our combined effort to combat the climate crisis. This series, which we're calling the Tribal and Indigenous Climate Speaker Series, will feature Indigenous speakers and/or federal agencies to share their knowledge and experiences. The webinar series focuses on federal agency employees as the primary audience, but all participants are welcomed. The Executive Director of the White House Council on Native American Affairs, Morgan Rodman, will provide some closing remarks at the end of today's presentation, including some information on the next webinar planned in February. Today, I'm honored to launch the Tribal and Indigenous Climate Speaker Series with a discussion on the recently released guidance on Indigenous knowledge for federal agencies and departments. Today's discussion is led by our colleagues from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. I'm happy to introduce Haley K. Scott and Aulani Wilhem. Haley is a member of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and a descendant of the Klamath Tribes, Yurok Tribe, and Sokogan Band of Chippewa Indians. She currently serves as a policy assistant for the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy's Climate and Environment team. And Aulani is serving as Assistant Director for Ocean Conservation, Climate and Equity at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Her home office is with Conservation International. So welcome, Haley and Aulani, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn things over to you now.
Sorry for the delay, just making sure folks can hear me and see me, and it looks like it. So hello, everyone. Thank you, Lisa, for the introduction, and thank you, Assistant Secretary Newland, for those opening remarks. I am so excited to be here with all of you today to help kick off the Tribal and Indigenous Climate Webinar Series. Again, my name is Haley K. Scott, and I'm a member of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and a descendant of the Klamath Tribe, Yurok Tribe, and Sokogan Band of Chippewa Indians. and I am originally from Oregon and grew up in the traditional homelands of my Klamath ancestors. And so, as Lisa mentioned, I will be co-presenting today with my OSTP colleague, Aulani Wilhem, on the recently released government-wide guidance on Indigenous knowledge. Next slide, please. So before we jump into our presentation, we wanted to provide a brief background on terminology and definitions. As some of you might know, there is not one term that encapsulates the knowledge that is held by tribes, Indigenous peoples, and communities. There are a few different terms that are used to describe or refer to the cultural, natural, historical, present knowledge and lifeways, including traditional ecological knowledge, traditional knowledge, and Indigenous knowledge. Stories are also used dependent on the context, place, and the person you're talking to. So for the purposes of this presentation, you will likely hear us use the term Indigenous knowledge while recognizing that this isn't the only term that exists. Next slide. So the purpose and goals of the guidance document is to, 1, achieve a more equitable and inclusive process and evidence-based in federal actions. 2, to respond and act on requests we received from tribal leaders to include Indigenous knowledge in federal decision-making. And 3, to stay aligned with the President's Racial Equity Executive Order, EO 13985, and presidential memos on tribal consultation and consultation standards. Next slide. So as mentioned by Assistant Secretary Newland earlier, the Biden-Harris administration has made a commitment to strengthening relationships with tribal nations. It is a priority of the Biden administration to fulfill the federal trust and treaty responsibilities to tribal nations. This commitment has launched several efforts, including a recommitment to Executive Order 13175, which requires each agency to prepare and periodically update a detailed plan of action to implement the policies and directives of that executive order. Next slide, please. So a little bit more on Executive Order 13175. So this was originally issued by President Clinton in the year 2000, recommitted when Biden-Harris administration came into play, and it applies to rules, policies, and guidance with tribal implications. Tribal implications are defined as having substantial direct effects on one or more Indian tribe, on the relationship between the federal government and Indian tribes, or on the distribution of power and responsibilities between the federal government and Indian tribes. And it also requires the federal government to consult with federally recognized tribal nations on policies that affect them. Next slide. Thank you. So the Biden-Harris administration hosted its first White House Tribal Nations Summit in November 2021. Among several announcements and discussion topics included in the event, President Biden announced the White House initiative to elevate the role of Indigenous knowledge in federal decision-making. This effort was motivated by requests from tribal leaders for the federal government to issue guidance around Indigenous knowledge and comes as part of the administration's commitment to strengthen relationships with tribal nations and Native communities. Next slide. So this effort was led jointly by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and the Council on Environmental Quality. The OSTP CEQ memorandum released at the 2021 Tribal Nations Summit announced a commitment and process to elevate Indigenous knowledge in federal decision-making. The guidance development process involved tribal consultation and public and expert input opportunities to ensure that Indigenous knowledge holders, scholars, and other relevant stakeholders meaningfully shaped the process and outcome. Next slide. So I wanted to highlight that the guidance development process also included an interagency working group with more than 25 federal agencies and departments represented. So this isn't an exhaustive list, but I wanted to give you a sense of the breadth and depth of agency expertise involved in this effort. Next slide. So in addition to the many federal career employees working towards the federal guidance, we have a White House team at the Office of Science and Technology Policy and Council on Environmental Quality who helped lead this effort. That includes myself and Aulani, as well as several other colleagues with relevant experience and perspectives. So that includes Dr. Gretchen Goldman, Rachel Daniel, Justin Pideaux, and Dominic Mayone. And you can see more information on the slide there. Next slide. Thank you. So at the December 2022 White House Tribal Nations Summit, the first in-person summit to take place in 6 years, OSTP Director Prabhakar and CEQ Chair Mallory jointly released the new government-wide guidance and an accompanying implementation memorandum for federal agencies on recognizing and including Indigenous knowledge in federal research, policy, and decision-making. This announcement coincides with the Biden-Harris administration's 2021 Tribal Nations Summit in response to the 2021 OSTP CEQ memorandum that called for the development of the guidance with tribal consultation and Indigenous community engagement, as well as agency expert and public input. I would like to highlight that over 300 tribal leaders were in attendance at the summit. Next slide. So before we tell you more about what's included in the guidance, I wanted to give a quick snapshot at the numbers. So to develop the guidance, OSTP and CEQ engaged more than 100 tribes, 1,000 individuals and organizations, and involved over 25 plus federal agencies in the development process. We also hosted 3 tribal consultations, 2 Hawaiian and Pacific Islander roundtables, 1 Native and Indigenous youth roundtable, and 1 public listening session. And before finalizing the guidance, we released a draft to tribes prior to the 3rd consultation to help guide feedback, and their comments were incorporated. And I now believe that I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Aulani, and will turn my camera off. Thank you.
Oops, is my audio on now? Okay. Thank you so much, Haley. It is really a pleasure to share the stage here with you and with our Assistant Secretary and everyone else here. Thank you so much for everyone for joining. I'm Aulani, I'm a Native Hawaiian, and I'm really pleased to be part of this team as well. And so, you know, Haley just really set an important stage for how did we get here? So what's in what's in this guidance? I think the guidance really aims to do a number of things. And at first, to provide an understanding and an overview of Indigenous knowledge. Haley alluded to that earlier, including definitions and the importance really of including Indigenous knowledge alongside other forms of knowledge. It's important for us to have guidance and be able to have words that can describe this as we move forward in this important work. It also helps to provide guidance on really growing and maintaining the mutually beneficial relationships that with tribal nations and other Indigenous peoples that are really necessary, right, to appropriately and respectfully include Indigenous knowledge in decision makings. Trust is so critically important, and the guidance is really there's overall guidance to really help underscore that and help to provide examples and courage about how to really be able to do that. Next slide. The guidance also identifies statutory authorities and practices that can assist agencies to protect and to apply Indigenous knowledge, and again, collaborate with tribes and Indigenous people who possess it, right? Importantly, respecting the decision of tribal nations and other Indigenous peoples on whether or not to include or actually decline participation in federal processes. Context for such inclusion include considering, including, and applying Indigenous knowledge in areas of federal research, policies, and decision-making, such as rulemaking, research design, grant making, and other federal funding opportunities, and also highly influential scientific assessments, such as the National Climate Assessment that I'm going to share an example in a little while. Next slide. The guidance provides context for the application of Indigenous knowledge in specific statutory contexts, such as the ESA, the NEPA, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, all of which you can read in this slide. And I think these are really intended to be examples, not an exhaustive list, right? To show the potential for elevation and inclusion of Indigenous knowledge far beyond, but there is potential, for that elevation and application of Indigenous knowledge far beyond these statutes, right? Often Indigenous knowledge or the perception, even among some of our peoples, is that Indigenous knowledge applies to ecological contexts alone, right? It's clear for land and water and places. But the truth is Indigenous knowledge extends far beyond. So these statutory contexts are some of the early areas where Indigenous knowledge has already been endeavored to be included, but the opportunity, really the possibilities extend far beyond. And really, finally, the guidance document includes 16 case studies that provide examples on effective and respectful inclusion, incorporation of Indigenous knowledge, and partnerships that already have been taken place in federal contexts with tribes and other Indigenous communities. The guidance also includes several useful appendices. Next slide. And Appendix C is one such example. The draft survey shown here in this slide provides an example of how the United States Global Change Research Program seeks to ensure that Indigenous knowledge can be considered consistent with the Information Quality Act. Right, this is an important example. The survey was developed as an update to the guidance for the authors. And the topics included in this checklist include things like transparency and traceability, objectivity, integrity and security, and reproducibility. These are important because these have been seen as barriers in the past for why Indigenous knowledge may or may not be able to be consistent with the Information Quality Act. And so this really useful appendice helps to break that down. And I think give an example of how in other contexts, when it appears that there might be barriers to applying and respectfully utilizing or engaging Indigenous knowledge with consent, that there are opportunities and ways to do something similar like this, to provide a checklist or to figure out another tool that can help bring these things together. Next slide. So to bring this home, I mentioned earlier that there are 16 examples, and some of these here in the dark, in the bold, are examples particular to this audience related to climate. Right, these are illustrations where mutually beneficial collaborations are possible and are beginning with tribes and Indigenous peoples. And they include input from and reflect the perspectives of Indigenous peoples, organizations, individuals, and also the federal agencies involved in these particular efforts. In the 4th National Climate Assessment that I mentioned earlier, that's to be released later this year, it includes at least one example of climate impacts or adaptation practices unique to tribes or Indigenous peoples in each of the 10 regional chapters. And many of those examples are based on local Indigenous knowledge for the region. And these provide examples and hopefully will stimulate future application as inspiration even of how Indigenous knowledge can be brought in respectfully to each of these really important federal initiatives. Other examples of the application of Indigenous knowledge in federal climate decision-making include the listing of species under the ESA, habitat designation decisions made by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA, and the consideration of Indigenous knowledge in the Bureau of Indian Affairs Climate Resilience Investments. The Northern Bering Sea, another example highlighted here, resilience area, which was established by executive order in 2016 and reinstated by President Biden in 2021, established a federal task force and a tribal advisory council. And both are charged with conserving the region's ecosystem, including the natural resources that provide important food security to people of the region. Tribes, regional Alaska Native nonprofit organizations, elders, and knowledge holders, Indigenous knowledge holders from across the region are working with the federal government to address concerns, important concerns about rapid climate change and the need for solutions that take a really whole of government approach to bring equity and build equity into the entire decision-making process. Another example, one last quick example of Indigenous knowledge is in the USDA Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu. This menu was developed by a diverse group of collaborators representing USDA, tribal, academic, intertribal, and government entities in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan as an opportunity to provide a framework to integrate Indigenous knowledge, culture, language, and history, right? All of those things into climate adaptation planning. It was developed as part of the climate change response framework. The tribal climate adaptation menu is designed to work with both the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science Adaptation workbook, or to actually be a standalone resource. And that's really the goal, right? Is that these examples provide ways to work with other resources, and that over time, we're really going to build kind of a library, if you will, of resources and examples that can make all of this very tangible and real. And therefore, we can have new examples of how to do this very quickly. There are other appendices and important resources, for example, a list of agency guidance documents that already exist. In Appendix E, there are promising practices that can be applied when considering Indigenous knowledge for people who are like, hey, how do we do this, right? What are ways that in the way we do our work, we can develop practices, agency practices that can help us really do this in very simple and straightforward ways. And also in Appendix F, there are also additional resources for federal research design and implementation. And this is really, really important because there's been so many examples of where federal research has really, the design of that research, the implementation of that research has been at odds with community and tribal or Indigenous community concerns. And so that appendix, which will, I hope, provide a guide, but we also will have opportunities throughout the process to really build on that. So what's next? Next slide. Moving forward, concurrent to the release of the guidance, OSTP and CEQ released a National Science and Technology Council, NSTC, implementation memo that really sets another pathway forward. It has a 180-day progress report. It calls for a 180-day progress report. And importantly, the formation of an Indigenous Knowledge Subcommittee under the NSTC that will oversee implementation of this guidance moving forward. This is a massive opportunity for agencies to better recognize and include Indigenous knowledge in all of their activities, as many as possible. And really, from OSTP and CEQ, we're here to help with that process. It's a huge opportunity for agencies to move forward on this, to ask questions, to be able to come together through this subcommittee, learn from each other, share examples. And that subcommittee is now co-chaired by OSTP, CEQ, DOI, and HHS. And excitingly, we had our inaugural meeting yesterday. So just one more word on that before we change slides is this subcommittee is really built on an interagency working group that has been meeting since the announcement that these guidelines were going to be produced. I came on board after that, and I will say in my 16 years of federal service, it was one of the most pleasureful experience, right? The coming together and the people who came from all the agencies in this working group really rolled up their sleeves and dug in. These meetings, people came, they showed up, they kept coming and really doing this work. And this work was not just developed by OSTP and CEQ. It was really the work of that entire working group. And this subcommittee will build on that. I hope that many members of that working group are on this call today. And I just want to really recognize them and all of the agency support that went into doing this, because it's really a next step. This is an important next step, but the real work now begins here. And so that's really the final slide, right? This is a foundation for, you can change to the slide. This is a foundation for any future work. So we hope this guidance provides a broad framework. We look forward to agencies really downscaling that guidance and providing much more specific guidance in the various contexts of each agency, because how Indigenous knowledge will be thought of and considered in agencies will differ, because the mandates, mission, and requirements of each agency will differ. So we really hope this guidance will help set that foundation, that the new subcommittee will continue to provide a forum and a framework for agencies to come together to be able to make this work real and really grow. So thank you so much for making the time to be part of this. Thank you to the organizers for considering having this topic be its inaugural topic for this year. We really look forward to continuing to engage in this important seminar series. And thank you all for your interest in your work.
Thank you, Aulani, and thank you, Haley, for the presentation and the information. It was very, very informative to all of us, so thank you so much. We wanted to be able to take some questions. We have about 20 minutes to have some discussion. So I can start with those who are with us here virtually. If you would like to raise your hand. All right, I see a hand is raised. And I'm not going to be able to pronounce it correctly. Aranzizu? Tom, can you help with unmuting?
It should be unmuted at this point.
Should be unmuted. All right. Aranzizu? While we wait,
significant things can happen to move that forward. And so I think we just identified a really important topic for the subcommittee to dig in on. And that was one of the focus areas of the subcommittee yesterday, was to identify members. So related to the first question, how do you contact? I think one of the steps is to also provide the contact people of the subcommittee so people can know who's on that and with the agent, and they can help, because every agency is different. Every agency has its own ways of communicating and its own set of internal communication complexities. So that's not going to be unique to any one agency, and the answer is going to be different. So relatedly, that subcommittee needs to identify focal areas. And that, again, I'm not at all sidestepping the issue of trust, but it's not a trust responsibility. It's not a simple answer. And it's a really, really important one, right? It's actually at the core of how to be able to carry this out effectively. So thanks for the question. I know it was tough to get in there with mute and all of that, but thanks for persevering. You've hit a really important one.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the question and for Haley and Aulani responding. I'll go to the hands now. And Robert Richards or Richardson, I can't see your full name, Richardson. If you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity. I'm Robert Richardson. I'm chief economist at the Department of the Interior, and I have I've skimmed over the guidance, which I found really interesting, and noticed multiple references to scientists, scientific information, science. But I didn't find any references to economics or the social sciences, sort of broadly. And I realize science can be interpreted broadly, but it's something that my colleagues and I have been discussing in great detail. Economists deal with things like economic value, in the context of, ecosystem restoration, climate change adaptation? What are the costs associated with those? Indigenous knowledge could greatly inform those kinds of discussions when they pertain to tribal communities and Native communities. And so I guess I'm offering this as a comment or a question. Will there be opportunities to provide guidance on economics, economic analysis, and the social sciences more specifically, or are there resources we could turn to for that? Thank you.
So another great focus area and question. First of all, I think it is implied that science is broadly being used, and economics and social science, coming from a social scientist myself, that's implied, and it's super important. Those are our sciences, and they are part of what is the intention of moving this forward. So first of all, thank you. And the short answer to the second one is yes. And in fact, there's a couple of initiatives, happening right now relative to national accounting standards. And this actually came up in comments on a draft that was released very recently. So while I don't want to divert this entirely off of because there's other questions coming, I would really welcome that opportunity to connect with you and to connect you up with our colleagues who are working on that. And perhaps, I don't know what the schedule is on this seminar series, but I could see a really important discussion, or even a panel discussion on not only the importance and the opportunities as you've identified, but where there might be near-term applications of being able to do that. I think it underscores exactly why this framework is important, because once it's there, right, these are the kinds of ideas that can help now have a home to flourish and be able to be carried out under, right, irrespective of now this guidance. Hey, ask those questions. How can we do that? How should that be done? Who else might be working on that across government that we can pull together and actually focus on that? It's also potentially another focal area topic for that subcommittee. So thanks.
Thank you. I'm actually involved in the national strategy that you mentioned.
Oh, great.
It was partly that initiative that prompted my question, because we want to fulfill that role appropriately and engage. So I'd love to touch base with you on that one, but thanks so much for the answer.
I would welcome that. I think our contact is in the info, but not too hard to find. I'd love to talk further with you about that.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go back to the chat, and while I read this one off, if you are on the phone and you want to be able to raise your hand, you can do that with *9. So you can go ahead and be raising your hand on the phone while we read this question. From Brian Harrison, it says, can you provide a specific example of how this policy of using Indigenous knowledge input into decisions on policy is being implemented?
So I can just speak about one example that comes to mind, and then I've also had the opportunity to work on a little bit in my prior experiences here at OSDP, and that's the integration of traditional burning on the traditional homelands of some of the Northwest peoples in Northern California. And so that work has actually started to begin, and it's been in play for a couple of years now, and the tribes there have been taking a big part in it. And so that example can be found in the guidance document and as part of those case studies that Aulani talked about. And so you can see that that's why we included those case studies, was trying to highlight that this work is already ongoing. And so we're not recreating the wheel with this. We're more of just trying to build upon existing work that's already happening. And so that's one minor example. Aulani, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, Aulani, you're on mute.
I was going to suggest starting with those 16 examples, and also to, that work has happened already, and this guidance is intended on lifting up that work. Right. It's not like all of a sudden a new policy that now makes this possible. It's really providing a framework and context to lift that work up and to extend the possibilities. from me personally, working and I work in nature space, right? In conservation for the most part has been my career. Ecological knowledge has been something that's been focused on. But in that work, it's become really clear to me that a bigger opportunity is, as I mentioned earlier, to extend beyond that. And that's where we need new examples. That's where we need to be able to look at this guidance and say, gosh, how do we look at that when we're talking about, housing and healthcare and national security? Where is that application of knowledge, and how do we actually do that using the examples and experiences that we've had with land and water, for example, fisheries in the past? So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. And then I'm going to go, Rachel, thank you for your patience. This is Rachel Golden Kroner. If you want to ask your question.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Lisa. Hi, Aulani. And thanks so much to you and Haley for the presentation. So I'm a AAAS fellow at USAID. And one of the things I'm working on is the scientific integrity policy at USAID, which is also being developed following guidance from OSTP. And it seems there's some synergies between these concepts of, scientific integrity and in the context of Indigenous knowledge. But one potential point of pushback I see here as we're updating the scientific integrity policy is that, well, is Indigenous knowledge science, and does it fall under the purview of scientific integrity? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this and how the guidance treats any synergies or tensions between these concepts that can help us with scientific integrity. Thanks.
Haley, so Haley was involved far before I was, but I will just say that this issue, Rachel, and hi, nice to see you. Well, I don't see you, I can just hear you, that this issue has come up, right? And that tension exists, and there's not going to be one answer, right? Some in Native communities see knowledge as science. Others see the binning of knowledge in a discipline of science as a narrowing of what it is and its opportunity. So I think struggling through that question is similar to figuring out, like, what are the ways to come up, like that checklist before, as an example. So if the intent is to figure out how Indigenous knowledge in its various forms can be able to be utilized and have a level of integrity that is comparable or able to be brought together with other types of science that has that label, then that's where the work is, to be able to do that, right? Because there isn't a simple answer. But that knowledge is super important and can be helpful. So not figuring that out actually will be a very limiting factor in Western science, in the application of Western science alone, right? And that's why bringing this guidance forward, that's an important piece of why to do this, is because that work and actually that dialogue and that set of understandings needs to come forward, right? It needs to be brought out so that all of these kinds of perspectives can be heard, aired, and then worked through. Because otherwise we miss out on massive data sets, if you will, massive intergenerational data sets and knowledge, right? It's not just information. If you think about that information pyramid, right? Indigenous knowledge holds every layer of that information pyramid up to wisdom. And so how do we address that is actually the work to be done. So I'm not trying to evade your question, Rachel. It's again, like the question about trust, right? These are where, this is why this guidance is important and why it's important to move these conversations and answer these questions together.
Thank you.
That's my opinion. It is my personal opinion. I want to emphasize that. And that's my lived experience as a Native person working in sciences, trying to bring this stuff forward and navigating through these very tough and often very emotional and emotion as a powerful thing, not as a bad thing, right? When you talk about intergenerational knowledge, when you talk about ancestral memory, right? This stuff is emotional. And it's important for that to be able to have that a context and a space to be brought in. And when it is, there's some magic in my personal lived experience.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I just do want to let everyone know it's kind of a little less than 5 minutes left. So maybe we can get 2 more questions in. Oh, my chat just moved, so sorry about that. So this question is from Malia Chow. Aulani, so good to see you, and thank you for this presentation by you and Haley. The information is timely. We are deliberating as to how best to engage Indigenous knowledge for a marine national monument that includes communities outside of the U.S. I know this is a specialized situation, but we are inspired by Papahana Mokakia, and there are several non-U.S. Indigenous communities we would like to engage. Does the guidance cover the non-U.S. communities on how best to engage them?
Haley, I'm talking too much. You want to start?
I think it'd actually be good for you to start, Aulani, since you have a little bit more background on that engagement of I guess, federally recognized tribes or non-U.S. Indigenous communities. I'm happy to follow up, though, with some more of like what's actually included in the guidance or not. So go ahead.
Yeah. So aloha, Malia. Nice to hear you on text as well. So this is an issue that came up, right? If our colleagues in the State Department ask similar questions, right? What does it mean for us, and what is the guidance to use when working with Indigenous peoples and tribes within our national borders, if you will? And how do you think, how does the US or US agencies engage externally with tribes? And it gets tricky, right? Because externally, if they are independent nations, then that's a nation to nation kind of engagement. But as an agency, right, I think using the same principles to go externally and to engage the knowledge holders and the voices and participants from other Pacific communities in the example you raise, it's following the same principles, right? And ultimately it's the principles of respect and of, you know, what is in kind of international standards of prior and informed consent, free, prior, and informed consent, right? It gets tricky with whether or not, you know, what the US position is on all of that, but practically speaking, right, it's the right thing to do. It's an important thing to do, and important information and perspectives will be yielded from that process. It is going to be further work because that issue is not totally resolved or outlined, but it is something that our colleagues from the State Department have asked and have expressed interest in being able to pursue and think about. But from an agency standpoint, you know, I think the guidance provides the guidance would indicate that it's an important thing to do, Malia.
Thank you, Haley and Aulani. We are pretty much at time, and I do want to have a few minutes to turn it over to Morgan Rodman to make some closing remarks. For those of you that have been in the chat, just be sure to take a look, as there's been some correspondence and people kind of helping each other out, answering questions here and there. There's some good ideas in here, some questions that I think would be very informative, Aulani and Haley, like you were talking about, as the implementation work group gets up and running. And we'll try to respond to questions that are in the chat the best we can in follow-up emails. I did just want to turn to Morgan to provide some information on the next webinar that we'll have in the Tribal and Indigenous Climate Series speakers. I don't know if everyone knows Morgan. He's certainly not a stranger to the White House Council on Native American Affairs. He was first executive director under the Obama administration and has held a number of key positions in the Department of Interior that help to advance our work with tribal governments. So Morgan, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and also thank you to the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, Brian Newland. for your leadership with the White House Council on Native American Affairs, and for helping to successfully launch the Tribal and Indigenous Climate Speaker Series today. Haley and Aulani, on behalf of the White House Council, I want to acknowledge your work in helping to develop the guidance and for bringing this timely and very important information to all of us here today. I think the number of participants on today's call speaks volumes towards demonstrating the earnest interest employees across all federal agencies and departments have on incorporating Indigenous knowledge in decision-making, especially as we consider tribal interests in our climate-related work. Since the White House Council was restarted early in the Biden-Harris administration, climate change and its impacts on tribal communities, economies, and lifeways has been on the forefront of our efforts. And this webinar series is designed to provide educational resources to all of you in considering these impacts every day in the work you do. If you have ideas for future topics, please share them in the chat, reach out to me or someone on this team that you've met today, or provide feedback in the follow-up materials you'll receive from Lisa. So I want to encourage you to attend our next webinar on February 8th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. The sponsoring agency is the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and we'll be hearing from 2 tribal historic preservation professionals on their work with addressing cultural resources and sacred sites in climate change planning and response. Registration will be available soon. Again, thank you so much for your participation in today's call, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.